10,000 years ago, the world was supposed to be quiet. Small bands of foragers, stone tools, campfires under endless stars. No cities, no empires, no armies. Just scattered humans learning to live after the Ice Age. That's what we thought. Until archaeologists dug into a remote desert valley and found something that shouldn't exist. Rows of skeletons lined up like soldiers. Arrowheads embedded in ribs. Shields made from layered animal hide. Formation patterns frozen in the dirt. It looked less like a hunt gone wrong and more like a battlefield. A real one. Radiocarbon dates came back and everyone thought the lab made a mistake. But they didn't. 10,000 years old. Centuries before the First Kingdom, the first writing, the first wall. The First War, somehow already organized. The oldest known battlefield on Earth. A war fought before civilization itself. And the deeper they dug, the stranger it got. Two different peoples, foreign weapons, possible commanders, even a broken standard buried among the dead like a fallen flag. The entire story of human history cracked open right there in the sand. We thought war came after civilization. What if it created it? If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you're watching from. I check comments and it's like Cairo at sunrise, New York after midnight. All of us, still trying to understand the wars that built the world. You know that feeling when you realize the ground you're standing on has seen things that were never meant to be remembered? That's what the team in the desert felt when their shovels hit bone. At first, they thought it was just another burial site. Maybe a few ancient hunters who had died together. But as the sand was brushed away, a pattern began to appear. Rows, lines. A rhythm in death that felt intentional. Then came the carbon dates, and everything stopped. 10,000 years before today, that was impossible. Civilization wasn't supposed to exist yet. Not armies, not battles, not anything like this. But the bones didn't lie. The first thing that shocked them was the order. The bodies weren't scattered like victims of an ambush. They were arranged, shoulder to shoulder, as if they had fallen together in ranks. Dozens of skeletons facing the same direction, arms tangled around the same crude weapons, obsidian blades, and stone points still buried in ribs. Whoever these people were, they died fighting, not by accident, but by design. The more they uncovered, the stranger it got. There were no walls here, no villages, no sign of permanent settlement. Just open land bordered by a dried river and the shadows of old cliffs. Whoever fought here had chosen this spot on purpose. It was a battlefield, not a graveyard. That shouldn't have been possible. According to everything we know, 10,000 years ago, humans were still learning how to farm, how to stay in one place, how to live together without starving. War on this scale didn't fit. It didn't belong. And yet, the story written in the bones said otherwise. Some of the skeletons had sharp cuts across the skull, perfectly angled blows. Others had projectiles still lodged in them. A few were missing limbs entirely. These weren't hunters taken by surprise. This was violence repeated, trained, practiced. Someone had planned this. Someone had led this. Someone had won. And for the first time in history, we were staring at the proof. The air around the excavation felt heavy, like the past was watching. One scientist described it as uncovering a secret that didn't want to be found. The desert had hidden its memory under sand for 10 millennia, and now, exposed under the sunlight, it whispered questions we couldn't answer. Who were these people? Why did they fight? What were they defending or trying to take? Every bone was a clue. Every broken weapon a line in a forgotten script. The more they uncovered, the more it looked like this place was never meant to exist in our timeline. A battle older than civilization itself. 10,000 years before kings and empires, before writing and history books, before the word war even existed, a valley of death carved by people who weren't supposed to know how to kill on this scale. And that's the terrifying part. Because if war existed this early, maybe it wasn't born from civilization at all. Maybe it was born with us. When the team expanded the dig site, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't the random violence of desperate tribes. It looked organized. The bones were positioned in ways that made too much sense. Bodies fell in rows, not clusters. The wounds were similar, angled and repeated, like someone had drilled them for efficiency. The soil still held fragments of stone points, grouped in the same direction, as if a wave of projectiles had struck from one side. It was a battlefield frozen in time, and the more they mapped it, the more it looked like something we shouldn't see for another 5,000 years. In textbooks, the word army belongs to a much later world, a world with cities, kings, and banners. But whoever fought here already understood what an army was. They fought in formation, with coordination that should have been impossible for small forager bands. Archaeologists began to notice clusters of similar weapons. Same shape, same material, same craftsmanship. Obsidian flakes sharpened with practiced skill, wooden shafts carved to the same length. Someone was making these tools in quantity, not one by one for hunting, but for distribution, as if supplying troops. The more they measured, the clearer it became. This was no local feud. It was logistics. One team compared it to a modern infantry formation scaled down to a world of stone and bone. A left flank scattered with defensive wounds on the forearms. A central line showing blunt trauma from close combat. A retreat zone littered with fallen runners struck from behind. Even the spacing between bodies told a story of discipline, of men and women who fought side by side under some form of leadership. But how? How could hunter-gatherers coordinate like this? There were no kings here, no generals, no bronze weapons or horses. Yet something about these people allowed them to act together in large numbers. They communicated, they trained. They trusted one another enough to hold a line under fire. That means there were rules, signals, maybe even rituals before battle. The idea that organized warfare started with civilization might be completely wrong. Maybe it was organized war that created civilization. The scientists debated endlessly, some refusing to accept what they saw. Others whispered that this discovery could rewrite human history. The deeper they dug, the more the site pushed back against every assumption. It was as if a page of history had been torn out and buried under 10,000 years of sand. When they finally mapped the full extent of the grave, it stretched farther than they imagined, hundreds of bodies locked in the same silent choreography of death. Whoever commanded this force didn't just lead a fight, they led a people. And that thought chilled everyone at the site. Because if humans could build an army before they built cities, then war wasn't born out of power. It was power. The first thing the archaeologists noticed when they brushed away the dirt were the blades. Not random stone shards like you'd expect from hunters, but thin, perfectly shaped pieces of obsidian. Each one was sharp enough to cut through flesh even after 10,000 years underground. They were identical in size and design, like they had been mass-produced. That made no sense. Standardization means planning, organization, someone deciding how every weapon should look and then teaching others to copy it. This wasn't survival, this was industry. Then came the projectiles. Hundreds of them, tiny microliths shaped like arrowheads or spear tips. They were found in clusters, sometimes still embedded in bones. The strange thing was how many types there were. Some short and light, made for distance. Others, longer and heavier, built for close combat. A few were barbed, meant to stay lodged once they hit. Whoever made these didn't just know how to kill, they knew how to adapt. To build a set of tools for different roles, like soldiers carrying specialized gear. The deeper they dug, the weirder it got. Wooden fragments wrapped in hardened animal hide, shaped in curves that fit the arm perfectly. At first, the team thought it was just debris, maybe a broken basket. But when they reassembled it, the truth hit. It was a shield. 10,000 years ago, someone had invented defensive gear. Layered animal skin glued with resin and reinforced with thin wood strips. Light enough to carry, strong enough to block a blow. It was primitive armor, but armor all the same. You can almost imagine it. The glint of obsidian under the sun. The dull thud of clubs meeting shields. They weren't just fighting with tools of desperation. They were fighting with design. That's what scared the scientists most. The toolkit was tactical. It showed specialization, maybe even ranks within the group. Some made the blades. Others carved the clubs. Others shaped and stretched hide for shields. This was division of labor, something that shouldn't appear until thousands of years later in settled farming societies. Yet here it was, buried in dust, silent proof that humans were already thinking like commanders and quartermasters. Even the way materials were gathered told a story. Obsidian doesn't naturally form near this valley. It must have been carried from far away, maybe traded or stolen, meaning there was supply, movement, routes. Someone coordinated it all. Someone understood that a well-armed force needed resources and organization. These weapons didn't belong in this era, but they were here anyway, mocking every timeline we've built. It's hard not to picture them lined up on the morning of the fight, holding shields, gripping blades, waiting for a signal. 10,000 years ago, long before nations or empires, there were already people who knew how to wage war. They didn't need kings to tell them. The weapons told them everything they needed to know. When the bones were first laid out on the examination tables, they looked like chaos. Broken skulls, shattered ribs, arms twisted in strange angles. But when the bioarchaeologists started to record the wounds, patterns began to emerge. Every fracture had a story. The defensive wounds were the first clue. Almost every skeleton had deep cuts across the forearms and wrists, the kind that come from blocking blows. These weren't random injuries. They were deliberate, repeated, and concentrated in the same areas. It meant the victims were facing their attackers head-on. They were fighting. When the team mapped the skull wounds, things became even stranger. The angle of impact was almost identical in dozens of skeletons. A downward strike, precise and fatal. It wasn't wild fighting. It was synchronized, controlled. Whoever struck these blows knew what they were doing. They hit the same spot over and over, as if trained to finish the job cleanly. The pattern was so consistent, it looked rehearsed. That word made everyone nervous. Rehearsed. Because rehearsal means planning, instruction, a system. And 10,000 years ago, systems of war weren't supposed to exist. The projectile evidence added another layer. Most of the stone points were embedded from one direction. All the arrows and thrown weapons came from the west side of the site, suggesting that one group advanced in a unified line. That kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. It means someone was giving orders. Someone was calling the timing of volleys. The battlefield, when reconstructed, looked like a chessboard. The right flank showed a pile of bodies with crushing injuries, likely from close combat. The left side had clean punctures and sharp trauma, the result of ranged attacks. The center was a storm of broken ribs and skulls, where both forces must have collided in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. This wasn't a skirmish between frightened hunters. It was a tactical assault. As the data piled up, one researcher whispered what no one wanted to say out loud. Doctrine. The kind of organized violence that required planning, training, and repetition. It was the earliest evidence of military strategy ever found. Even stranger were the wounds that didn't kill immediately. Several skeletons showed signs of healing from previous battles, scarred bone and fused breaks. These people had fought before. They were veterans. It meant this wasn't an isolated fight. It was part of a cycle. Conflict was already routine. Every new scan, every measurement added to the same uncomfortable truth. 10,000 years ago, someone was already thinking like a general. They positioned troops. They coordinated attacks. They anticipated defense. They fought with intelligence, not instinct. The excavation began as a study of ancient death, but it ended as something else entirely, the first forensic autopsy of war. A glimpse into the moment humanity learned how to kill with precision. The moment the first radiocarbon results came back, everyone thought it had to be a mistake. 10,000 years before today, the dawn of the Holocene, a time when the last ice age had just ended and humans were supposed to be learning how to plant seeds and herd animals, not slaughter each other on a massive scale. The lead archaeologists stared at the numbers, confused, then sent new samples to another lab. Weeks passed. The results came back the same. A third test was ordered, then a fourth. Each one confirmed the same impossible truth. The site was older than the first cities, older than metal tools, older than any written word. Yet here was evidence of organized battle as if it belonged to a civilization that didn't exist yet. Scientists tried to rationalize it. Maybe the layers had shifted. Maybe younger artifacts had mixed with older soil. Maybe natural erosion had played tricks on the readings. But the stratigraphy was perfect. The weapons, bones, and sediments all aligned. There was no contamination. The date held firm. 10,000 years before present. The news spread quietly through academic circles. It didn't make sense. History textbooks described that period as peaceful, with small groups of foragers scattered across fertile valleys, sharing water and food as they slowly learned agriculture. But the battlefield said something entirely different. It showed humans who were already fighting like soldiers, already capable of mass violence. The Holocene was supposed to be the era when the world calmed down, when melting glaciers brought stability, when humans began to cooperate instead of compete. Yet in this forgotten valley, the first peace of the new world began with war. The researchers started calling it the impossible date because it didn't fit anywhere. Civilization wasn't supposed to appear for thousands of years. Warfare of this scale belonged to the Bronze Age, not the Stone Age. But if the evidence was real, then maybe civilization didn't create war. Maybe war created civilization. The implications were terrifying. It meant humans had the capacity for strategy and dominance long before they had temples or palaces. It meant we were building armies before we were building cities. As the team presented their findings, skepticism turned into awe. Other archaeologists began to re-examine old sites, wondering if they had missed similar clues. Maybe traces of ancient conflict had been ignored because no one wanted to see them. If this battle really happened at the dawn of the Holocene, it changed everything about who we are. The world we thought was born from cooperation might have been forged through blood. The impossible date didn't just rewrite history. It reminded us that the line between peace and war, between creation and destruction, has been part of humanity from the very beginning. For decades, every history book said the same thing. Large-scale war needs civilization. You need cities to raise armies, kings to command them, and surplus food to feed them. Without those things, people were supposed to live in small groups, trading, hunting, and slowly learning to plant crops. Violence might happen, sure, but only small raids or personal fights. Nothing close to organized battle. But this site was laughing at that story. 10,000 years before today, long before palaces or fortresses, an army had marched and died in formation. The evidence was undeniable. Rows of bodies, identical weapons, tactical injuries. Someone was leading them. Someone was planning. So who fights this early? That question became the obsession of every researcher who touched the site. If these people had no kings, no fortifications, no armies, then what drove them to such a scale of conflict? Maybe we had misunderstood what civilization really is. Maybe it doesn't start with peace and cooperation. Maybe it starts with competition. Anthropologists began to dig through other early sites for clues. Some found charred villages. Others uncovered mass burials once thought to be from natural disasters. The pattern was spreading. Human groups across the end of the Ice Age may have been fighting for land and food long before agriculture united them. It makes sense when you think about it. When the ice melted, new rivers and grasslands appeared. But that also meant new pressure. Groups that had survived in harsh conditions suddenly had something worth fighting for. Territory, water, game. The same instincts that let us cooperate could also drive us to dominate. The strange truth is that organization and violence are cousins. To fight in formation, people must communicate, trust, and follow leaders. The same skills used to build communities can also build armies. The battlefield didn't just show death. It showed teamwork, training, planning, all things we associate with progress. So maybe war wasn't a side effect of civilization. Maybe it was one of its engines. Every theory that said early humans were peaceful gatherers started to crumble. The evidence showed something else entirely. They were capable of large-scale unity, not just to create, but to destroy. The team studying the valley called it the birthplace of contradiction, cooperation built for conflict, intelligence sharpened by survival, empathy and aggression locked in the same brain. It forced historians to face a difficult truth. The human story might not be a climb from savagery to peace, but a cycle that began with war and kept reinventing it. The site stood as proof that even before we learned to write or farm, we already knew how to fight together. Not as monsters, but as humans. Because maybe that's who we've always been, builders and destroyers in the same breath. Long before it became a graveyard, the valley was alive. A green ribbon cutting through the desert, its river fed by mountain rains that no longer fall. Back then, the land was different. Forests lined the banks, herds of gazelle and antelope moved in waves across the grasslands, and the air was thick with insects and birds. To the humans who lived nearby, this place would have looked like paradise. Fresh water, steady food, and fertile soil in every direction. But paradise always comes with a price. Geoarchaeologists used sediment cores to rebuild what the landscape looked like 10,000 years ago. They found pollen from trees that no longer exist in the region, traces of burned wood, and layers of ash and silt. The river had been wider then, its banks softer, easy to cross in some spots, but deep and treacherous in others. To move through this valley, you had to follow narrow paths between cliffs and marsh. Those paths were perfect for ambush, perfect for war. You can almost imagine it, a column of people moving along the river edge, their footsteps sinking into mud, the sound of insects buzzing in the heat. Then silence. Somewhere beyond the reeds, others are waiting, hidden behind trees and rocks, watching the water shimmer. The valley itself feels like a trap designed by nature long before humans ever stepped into it. The soil tells its story. Charcoal flecks scattered through the ground show where fires once burned. Not cooking fires, but big ones. Too large, too hot. Fires meant to signal or to destroy. Microscopic beads of iron and ash mixed into the dirt suggest that when the battle finally came, it came with fire. Smoke must have rolled across the water like a storm cloud. Even now, when the team walks the site at sunset, they say the air still feels heavy, like it remembers. The valley has become more than a location. It's a character, one that shaped everything that happened. It offered food, safety, and life, and then turned on those who tried to claim it. In a way, it mirrors human nature itself, beautiful and brutal at the same time. Archaeologists studying the river say its flow pattern changed shortly after the battle. Maybe the fighting broke the land. Maybe the fires altered the soil so much that water no longer moved the same way. Or maybe it's just coincidence. Still, there's something poetic about it. The river that once brought life became a divider of death. The people who fought here probably didn't see themselves as part of history. They were just defending or taking what they needed to survive. But in doing so, they turned this green corridor into a scar on the earth, a place that remembers both their hunger and their fear. The river of ash and blood. The name came later, but it fits. Because some places don't just witness history, they become it. 10,000 years ago, the valley was a world of green and gold. A river wound through it like a silver thread, feeding forests of acacia and clusters of reeds that shimmered in the sun. Herds of gazelle grazed in the open plains. Hippos slept in the shallows, and birds darkened the sky when they took flight. For early humans, this was the heart of abundance, a place where you could drink, hunt, and live without moving for weeks. But where there is plenty, there is always someone else who wants it. The first people who stood on these banks probably saw opportunity. The second saw a prize, and the third saw a trap. The valley was shaped perfectly for conflict. To the east rose steep cliffs that caught the morning light, their slopes impossible to climb without being seen. To the west lay marshes that could swallow a person whole. Between them ran a narrow corridor of dry ground. Whoever controlled that passage controlled the river. It was the kind of terrain where a small group could stop a much larger one. A perfect choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. Geoarchaeologists recreated the ancient landscape using cores of soil and pollen pulled from the ground. Each layer was like a page in a diary. They found traces of burned wood, layers of ash, and grains of sand blackened by heat. Fires had swept through this valley more than once. Not wildfires, but fires started by people. The same pattern appears again and again, years apart, always in the same stretch of land. It means the valley wasn't just a home, it was a border. A place fought over again and again, until it became sacred in memory and cursed in the earth. Standing there now, it's hard to imagine it as it once was. The river is gone, dried to a thin ribbon that disappears into dust. The air tastes of salt and wind. But dig a few feet down, and you still find its heartbeat. Sediment that smells faintly of life, of mud and roots and blood. The team nicknamed it the River of Ash and Blood after they realized how many battles might have played out along its banks. It was poetic, but also literal. In some layers they found human ash mixed with burned reeds. It meant the fires came after the fighting. Someone had tried to erase what happened, maybe as an offering, maybe as revenge. The valley itself became part of the story, almost alive in its cruelty. It gave everything needed to live, then punished those who tried to own it. Every bone buried here belongs to that same lesson. No matter how far back you go, the earth has always been both our ally and our enemy. And in this valley, it kept score. At first, everyone assumed the people buried in the valley were one tribe, maybe a community that turned on itself or split into rival clans. But when scientists began testing the teeth, the story changed completely. Isotopic analysis works like a time machine. It can tell what kind of water a person drank as a child, what kind of soil their food grew in, even what the air was like where they lived. The results showed two very different signatures. Half the people grew up in the valley. Their teeth carried traces of local water, rich in certain minerals found only in this region. The other half were outsiders. Their isotopes matched sources hundreds of miles away, maybe from higher ground or even a different climate zone. That meant this wasn't a local dispute, it was an invasion. One group had marched in from afar, carrying their own weapons, their own style of blade, making their own stories. The other group had defended the valley that fed them. Archaeologists started calling them the ghosts of two nations because they represented something that shouldn't exist that early in history. Nations meant shared culture, shared leadership, shared purpose. But here, 10,000 years before cities or borders, two distinct societies had met in organized war. Dental studies revealed even more. The valley people had stronger enamel, likely from diets rich in animal fat and river fish. The outsiders' teeth were flatter, worn from grinding tough plants and grains. It showed two ways of life colliding: the settled fisher, hunters of the river, and the nomadic foragers of the high plains. Maybe the outsiders came seeking food during a drought. Maybe they came seeking conquest. Either way, they met resistance. And in the middle of that resistance, history was written in blood. The differences weren't just in chemistry. The weapons were different too. The defenders used shorter blades designed for close combat. The invaders carried long throwing spears and barbed tips meant for distance fighting. It was as if two technologies, two strategies, were facing off. Even in death, their positions told the story. The outsiders fell mostly near the valley entrance. The locals were found deeper in, as if fighting to hold the river itself. The scientists began to realize they weren't studying one tragedy. They were studying diplomacy's first failure. The first time two human groups saw each other not as potential allies, but as enemies. The idea that humans were peaceful until agriculture suddenly felt like a myth. These were not neighbors arguing over hunting rights. They were entire peoples with different worlds in their heads, meeting for the first time in misunderstanding and fear. And when the dust settled, both sides vanished into the earth, leaving only bones and silence. Ghosts of two nations who fought before nations even had names. The morning air is thick with mist from the river. You wake before the sun, feeling the damp earth under your hands. The world is silent, except for the slow pulse of water and the muffled sounds of movement all around you. Shadows stir through the fog. People whisper to one another, tightening the straps of hide around their arms, checking the edges of their blades. The fire from last night has burned down to black coals, but the smoke still clings to your hair. Someone is painting your skin with red clay mixed with ash. The marks mean something, though no one speaks it out loud. They are symbols of protection, of identity, of memory. They turn your body into a message. When the first light hits the horizon, you can see the other side of the river. Faint shapes move there too. The invaders. the ones who came down from the dry hills with their long spears and their strange songs. You've never seen them this close before. Their faces are marked with white powder, their hair braided in ways that catch the sun. They look human, but different enough to feel wrong. The elders said they came from a place where the rain no longer falls, that they followed the river south in search of food. But now they want the valley itself, the land that has fed your people for generations, and today you will not give it to them. The signal comes not as a shout, but as a sound that rises deep in your chest. A single thud, then another. The rhythm spreads through the camp like thunder. Drums made from hollow logs, an animal hide echo across the mist. They are not for communication, they are for courage. Every beat tells you to move forward, to remember your family, to forget fear. Across the water the other side answers. Their rhythm is different, faster, almost frantic. The two beats clash in the middle of the valley like two hearts refusing to stop. You grip your spear tighter. You can feel the ground trembling with footsteps as your group moves into position. The fog swallows everything. All you see are flashes of motion, glimpses of red and white, the sparkle of obsidian blades. Then the first scream cuts through the air, sharp and human. Arrows whistle past. You rush forward, breath burning in your chest. You don't think about who you're killing, only that you must. The sound is overwhelming. The drums, the shouts, the clash of wood and bone, it all becomes one endless roar. By the time the sun rises fully, the mist has turned pink with blood. The drums fade, replaced by the slow hum of flies. You don't know who won. You only know that this place will never be the same again. The river remembers the sound, even if we don't. The drums we can't hear anymore are still echoing beneath the earth. When the archaeologists looked at the battlefield, one question refused to go away. Who led them? Someone had to. The formations were too organized, the attacks too precise. These weren't scattered hunters following instinct. They were following direction. But 10,000 years before kings and thrones, leadership had to look different. There were no crowns, no carved idols, no written orders, yet something bound these people together tightly enough to move as one. The researchers began piecing it together through the patterns of the site. The way the fallen lined up showed coordination. The placement of certain artifacts suggested ranks or roles. A group buried together carried matching obsidian blades, perhaps the core fighters. Another cluster near the center had broken clubs and scars from repeated wounds, likely the front line. Then there were the outliers, people with no weapons but strange objects near their remains, carved stones, pigments, bits of animal bone arranged deliberately. Maybe they were ritual leaders, tacticians of spirit rather than blood. Maybe in this world, strategy and ceremony were the same thing. It was here that the idea of commanders without kings began to take shape. Leadership not built on wealth or inheritance, but on charisma and reputation. Someone earned the right to command by surviving, by inspiring, by knowing what to do when fear froze everyone else. In small societies, that kind of influence can spread faster than any decree. One voice becomes a signal, one gesture becomes an order, and suddenly dozens of people act as one. It's possible that these early commanders weren't even permanent figures. They rose only during times of conflict, chosen by their groups to guide them through crisis, then faded back into the community once the danger passed. But the power to organize violence changes people. Once you see that a single decision can mean survival for hundreds, the idea of leadership starts to stick. It becomes a habit, and habits become systems. The scientists studying this site realized they might be looking at the birth of hierarchy itself. Maybe organized violence came first, and structure followed. Before there were kings, there were war leaders. Before there were laws, there were commands, shouted across a river. Violence required coordination, and coordination required obedience. The battlefield became humanity's first classroom in control. The ones who could plan and lead in war likely became the ones who ruled in peace. Even without palaces, these people had authority. It was in the way they moved together, in the way they fought with purpose. No one carved their names into stone, but their influence shaped every civilization that came after. Commanders without kings. They proved that hierarchy didn't begin in temples or courts. It began out there, in the dirt and blood, where survival demanded someone to take charge and others to follow. When the archaeologists began sorting the bones, they expected to find mostly adult men. That's what ancient battlefields usually reveal, men fighting while others stay behind. But this site refused to fit that pattern. Among the fallen were women, young men barely in their teens, even a few older adults well past what most would call fighting age. The shock wasn't just their presence, but their wounds. Fractured skulls, broken ribs, arrow points lodged deep in bone. The same trauma seen in the men. These weren't victims caught in the middle. They were fighters. The evidence showed that women stood on the front lines, defending the same territory, wielding the same weapons, dying in the same way. The scientists took extra care to confirm it. They studied the pelvic bones, the size of joints, the thickness of muscle attachments. The results were clear. The ratio of men to women among the dead was almost equal, and the injuries were identical. Cuts across the forearms from blocking strikes, blunt trauma to the head and chest, wounds from close combat. These people fought side by side. That changed everything. This wasn't a warrior caste. It was a community at war. Everyone fought because everyone had something to lose. In later civilizations, armies became separate from everyday life. Soldiers trained while others farmed, traded, and built. But here, 10,000 years before that separation, war was personal. The enemy wasn't just attacking a settlement. They were attacking families, homes, survival itself. Anthropologists began to imagine what that meant for these people. A child watching their mother lift a spear. A father teaching his daughter how to throw a stone blade. A grandmother sharpening weapons while younger fighters prepared for battle. The roles we think of as fixed weren't fixed at all. When survival is on the line, culture bends. In this valley, everyone was a soldier. It also revealed something profound about leadership. The idea that men alone held command collapses when you see this. Leadership may have been shared, fluid, built on experience rather than gender. If you could fight, if you could protect, you mattered. The bones told a story of equality written in scars. Archaeologists found one skeleton of a young woman whose skull had been shattered by a heavy blow. Near her was a cluster of fallen enemies. Her position suggested she had taken several down before dying. She was buried where she fell, no different from the others. No distinction between man or woman, just human. The battlefield became proof that in the earliest wars, survival didn't care who you were. Every pair of hands counted. Every voice shouted the same battle cry. It's strange to think that the first societies to fight might also have been the most united. No kings, no soldiers, no civilians. Just people standing together against the dark, proving that when everything is at risk, the line between protector and protected disappears completely. At first glance, the battlefield looked like chaos, a jumble of broken bones and shattered weapons scattered across the desert floor. But when the team began mapping the locations of every artifact, a pattern emerged. It wasn't random. The lines of death traced something deliberate. The points where obsidian blades and stone, tipped arrows clustered, weren't spread evenly. They curved in arcs. One arc on the left, another on the right, both converging toward the center. It looked like a flanking maneuver, the kind of strategy historians say didn't exist until organized armies thousands of years later. The researchers used drones to capture the entire site from above, and when the images came together, the story was unmistakable. One group had held a defensive line, shields overlapping like a wall. The attackers had split into two wings, circling and striking from both sides. The defenders held as long as they could, but the marks in the soil showed where the wall finally broke. The weapons changed there. The projectiles stopped, replaced by heavy clubs and short blades. Close combat, a final stand. These weren't wild hunters throwing stones. They were trained, coordinated, reacting to commands. Someone on this ground understood tactics. The distribution of the weapons told even more. The lighter arrows were grouped near higher terrain where distance mattered. The heavier spears lay near the center, dropped where the fighting was hand to hand. The remains of shields clustered in rows, the hides layered and burned where they must have met fire. Archaeologists found stones piled in small stacks behind the main line, possibly used as quick ammunition. It was logistics in motion, a sign that these fighters had prepared for sustained combat. They even seemed to anticipate retreat. A narrow line of footprints and discarded weapons led back toward the river, suggesting an organized withdrawal. Someone had planned escape routes. Someone had been giving signals. The question was how. There was no writing, no horns, no banners, but there were bones in strange positions, hands clutching small stones with markings carved into them. Maybe those were symbols of rank or communication tokens. Maybe the battlefield had a language of its own, one made of gestures, rhythm, and sound. The wind would have carried orders across the valley. A raised arm could mean advance. A shouted phrase could mean flank. A circle of dust kicked up by runners could mark direction. Every motion had meaning, even when words did not. When the scientists finished reconstructing the movements, they realized they were looking at the oldest record of tactical warfare ever discovered. Strategy written not on parchment, but in earth and ash. 10,000 years before generals, humans already knew how to coordinate, how to plan, how to fight as one. The dust still holds those signals. You just have to know how to read them. They found them near the edge of the site, half buried beneath layers of ash and river silt, a small cluster of skeletons lying close together, different from the rest. At first they looked no different from the other fallen, but when the bones were cleaned and studied, something extraordinary appeared. These people had been through battle before. Their bodies told stories of survival that stretched across years, maybe decades. One had a healed fracture in his forearm. The bone thickened and twisted where it had once snapped, blocking a blow. Another had an old arrowhead still embedded near the hip, surrounded by new bone that had grown around it like scar tissue. A third showed ribs that had been broken, healed, and then shattered again. Every skeleton in that group carried the marks of violence survived and repeated. They weren't victims of a single day's chaos. They were veterans. The idea hit the team hard. In the Mesolithic world, the concept of a career warrior wasn't supposed to exist. People hunted, gathered, and maybe fought when they had to. But these individuals had lived and died by the rhythm of battle. Their wounds proved they had fought before and returned to fight again. That meant something new in human history. It meant a way of life built around conflict. The researchers began to imagine who they might have been. Maybe they were protectors of the valley, experienced fighters who had survived earlier raids. Maybe they trained the young and led the charge when danger returned. Their bones showed muscle attachments stronger than average, arms and shoulders built from constant use of weapons. Their joints were worn, their teeth ground down from age and grit. These were not just survivors, they were specialists, the first soldiers long before the word existed. The placement of their graves told another story. They were buried close together, apart from the main battlefield, as if the living had honored them in death. Around them were fragments of tools, bits of jewelry, and a single carved figurine shaped like an animal head. Some of the soil near their remains had been burned, suggesting a small ritual fire. Whoever buried them knew what they had done and wanted the land to remember. The more scientists studied them, the clearer it became that war was not just an event for these people, it was a calling. The existence of veterans meant there was structure, memory, and shared experience. They must have told stories of their battles, passing down techniques and warnings to those who came next. Even without language as we know it, they carried knowledge in scars. When we think of soldiers today, we picture armor and ranks. But the first soldiers wore nothing but the skin of their own endurance. They fought with stone and wood, guided by instinct and loyalty. The silent survivors proved that even in the beginning, there were those who chose to stand between their people and the darkness, again and again, until they could stand no more. The soil beneath the battlefield held more than bones. When scientists drilled deep into the ground to study the ancient layers, they found the story of a changing world written in mud and pollen. 10,000 years ago, the climate was shifting fast. The last ice sheets had melted, flooding some regions while drying others. In this valley, the river that had once brought life was shrinking. Wetlands turned to cracked plains. Fish disappeared. Herds moved north. The people who lived here were caught between drought and hunger, and desperation always finds an enemy. The environmental cores showed alternating bands of dark and light sediment, each layer marking a season. The dark bands were wet years, the light ones were dry. Over time, the light bands grew thicker. It meant the droughts were getting longer. When the water thins, everything else does too. Plants die, animals vanish, and humans turn on each other. Archaeologists believe that was the spark. One group controlled the valley, its last reliable source of water. Another arrived from the highlands, driven by thirst and starvation. There may have been negotiation at first, trade or shared use. But as the drought deepened, generosity dried up. What began as cooperation turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into fear. And fear is the oldest reason to fight. Yet the evidence also suggests something more than simple survival. Among the remains were strange objects, not meant for hunting or daily life. Small carved figures, stones dyed red and black, beads of shell that must have come from far away. These weren't tools, they were symbols, offerings. The presence of ritual objects on the battlefield made the scientists realize this might not have been only a fight for food or water, it might have been a fight for meaning. When survival itself becomes uncertain, people look to the divine, they give their struggle a purpose. The first great battle in human history might have been both practical and sacred. A war over resources wrapped in belief. Each side may have thought they were chosen to hold the valley, that their gods had given them the right to the river. When they fought, they weren't just protecting territory, they were defending their identity. The soil even contained traces of ash from burned plants that were once used in rituals. It suggests that before the battle began, both groups performed ceremonies asking for victory. The world around them was dying, and they sought order in violence. In the end, the drought won anyway. The river continued to fade, the valley emptied, and the survivors scattered. The battle achieved nothing and everything at once. It solved no problem, but it created something new. It gave humans the idea that war could be sacred, that bloodshed could carry meaning, a war over nothing or everything, fought in a dying paradise, marking the moment when desperation and belief became one. It was found near the centre of the site, half buried among a cluster of bodies that seemed to have fallen together. At first, it looked like a length of weathered wood, blackened with age and snapped clean through the middle. But when the dirt was brushed away, carvings appeared. Spirals, animal shapes, and what looked like rising flames etched carefully along the surface. The object was not a weapon, it was ceremonial, carved with too much care to be a tool of war. The team called it the broken staff, but as they studied it, another word began to fit: standard. The kind of sacred symbol later armies would carry into battle to mark their identity and unity. The people buried around it weren't random either. Their positions suggested they had died protecting it. Their wounds were deep, their bones interlocked, as if they had formed a circle around the fallen object. Whoever held that staff must have mattered. The carvings told their own story. They weren't decorative. Each one had meaning. The spiral was a symbol of cycles, of return. The animal figures looked like the river creatures of the valley, perhaps emblems of life or territory. The flames might have represented power or the spirit of the group itself. If it truly was a banner, then it symbolized something larger than a tribe. It was a physical manifestation of identity, a mark that said we are one and we stand together. 10,000 years before flags, here was the first one, made not of cloth but of wood and belief. The discovery changed how the researchers saw the battle. Until then, it seemed like a struggle for survival. But this staff hinted at something deeper. These people fought not just for resources, but for an idea. They had a symbol worth dying for, something that gave their unity shape. That kind of devotion meant shared mythology, shared purpose. It meant that somewhere between survival and faith, humanity discovered meaning in collective identity. The most haunting part was how it broke. The fracture ran straight through the center, as if it had been struck in battle. Splinters of wood were found pressed into the soil, scattered like pieces of a dream destroyed. Maybe it fell when the bearer was struck down. Maybe it was broken deliberately after defeat, a final gesture to deny the enemy its power. Either way, it fell with its people. The staff's placement among the dead felt like an act of respect, the first unrecorded funeral for an idea. In later ages, kings would raise banners over empires. Armies would march under colours and signs. But it began here, in a forgotten valley, where someone carved a symbol to remind their people what they were fighting for. The broken standard still lies in the dirt, silent proof that even in prehistory, humans already believed in something greater than themselves. For most of modern history, people have loved to tell a comforting story about our beginnings. We say that once upon a time, humans were gentle foragers who lived in harmony with nature. That violence came later, when civilization appeared with greed, walls, and kings. The myth paints the past as an Eden we lost, but the bones in the valley tell another story. They whisper that war didn't start with civilization, it started with us. The site has become a kind of courtroom, and the charge is against our own imagination. For years, textbooks taught that conflict only appeared once humans formed states, built armies, and hoarded resources. But here, 10,000 years before writing, people already fought in formation. They already killed with precision. They already buried their dead beside the symbols they died for. The peaceful ancestor myth crumbles under the weight of that evidence. The truth is harder to face. Organized cruelty is as old as organized cooperation. You can't have one without the other. The same intelligence that lets people coordinate to build shelters also lets them coordinate to ambush enemies. The same communication that spreads knowledge can spread fear. The same empathy that binds a tribe together can turn outsiders into threats. In this valley, the evidence is everywhere. Shields arranged in defensive rows, projectiles clustered in arcs, wounds that show discipline, not chaos. These people weren't savages acting on instinct. They were soldiers acting on command. They planned, they trained, they strategized, and they did it all without kings, generals, or written laws. It forces a question we don't want to ask. If violence doesn't come from civilization, what if civilization comes from violence? What if the skills that built cities first evolved on battlefields? Leadership, loyalty, communication, even art, all have roots in our ability to work together against something else. The discovery in this valley doesn't make humans evil, it makes us complicated. It reminds us that compassion and cruelty grew from the same soil. The researchers who uncovered the site struggled with that idea. Some wanted to soften it, to say the war must have been an accident or an act of desperation, but the evidence refused to bend. The fighters here had structure, purpose, and a shared identity. They weren't caught in a tragedy. They were carrying out a plan. That realization changes everything. It means the line between good and evil doesn't run between past and present. It runs straight through every human heart. We are not fallen angels. We are evolved survivors. And sometimes survival has meant doing terrible things. The valley doesn't destroy our humanity. It defines it. The first time we worked together, it wasn't just to build. It was also to fight. And the story of who we are begins not in peace, but in the uneasy space where cooperation meets conflict, where kindness and cruelty learn to hold hands. If you stood on that valley floor 10,000 years ago, before the battle began, you would have heard language that no human today could understand. Not because it was primitive, but because it belonged to a world that no longer exists. The archaeologists can't hear the words, but they can see their echoes. You don't organize flanking lines or staggered volleys without communication. You don't form shield walls or timed retreats without language capable of structure. Somewhere between the river and the ash, commands were shouted that carried syntax, rhythm, and meaning. It wasn't grunting or pointing. It was speech built on abstract thought. When the scientists mapped the battlefield, they found groups moving in coordinated patterns. That meant someone gave instructions, and others understood them instantly. It required vocabulary for direction and time. Words like left, right, hold, now. It also required something harder to measure, shared trust in the meaning of those sounds. Language is more than noise. It's agreement. It's the invisible contract between mind and mouth that says, when I speak, you understand. These people had that. They had to. The battle would have been chaos without it. You can almost imagine it. Voices rising over the roar of the river, orders shouted and answered, signals called out through rhythm and tone. Some researchers believe they may have used chant, like phrases, repeated patterns that helped memory and timing. Short bursts of meaning carried by sound alone. Others think they combined words with gestures, hand signals that cut through the noise when the fighting grew too loud. Whatever form it took, it worked well enough to move hundreds of people with a single voice. That means they had grammar, not just vocabulary. Grammar is what lets humans describe what's not right in front of them, to talk about before, after, and maybe. It's what separates thought from instinct. The fact that this battle unfolded in complex sequence means they could think beyond the moment. They could imagine outcomes, plan reactions, and adjust. Language made that possible. Every arrow that flew on time, Every formation that shifted with precision was guided by shared thought turned into sound. When linguists study this site, they realize they're not just looking at bones. They're looking at evidence of spoken minds, people who could coordinate abstract plans in real time. They might not have written words, but they spoke worlds. The battle became their dictionary. Their verbs were to advance, defend, survive. And in those commands, you can hear the beginnings of everything we still are. Every sentence spoken today descends from moments like that, when someone had to make another person understand quickly or die. The language of the fallen isn't gone. It changed shape, split into thousands of tongues, filled books, built civilizations. But its purpose is the same: to unite thought, to turn chaos into coordination. The first words that saved lives may have been spoken here, shouted into the wind over a river that still remembers their sound. The battlefield wasn't just a place of death. It was a place of ceremony. When the archaeologists began documenting how the bodies were arranged, they noticed something strange. Most of the dead were scattered in the chaos you'd expect after combat, but some had been carefully positioned. Their hands folded over their chests, their weapons placed beside them, their faces turned toward the same direction. It wasn't random, it was ritual. Even here, amid blood and ash, there was order. Some of the graves were surrounded by small objects burned in controlled fires, bits of pigment, shells, carved stones. None of them useful, all of them symbolic. They weren't offerings to the dead so much as messages to whatever force these people believed governed life and death. The scientists realized they were standing on the edge of something sacred. War and religion were already entangled, long before temples or priests. You can picture the moment before the battle: fires burning low, people standing in a circle. Someone holds up a charm or a carved idol, maybe the same kind of object later buried among the dead. The fighters touch it, for luck or for blessing. Maybe they sing. Maybe they cut their skin and let the blood fall to the ground. Not superstition, but meaning. A way to give chaos shape, to tell themselves that what they're about to do matters to something larger than survival. The same patterns appear after the fighting ends. Some bodies are stripped and burned, others left untouched. A few are surrounded by animal bones, perhaps from a feast held in their honor. The arrangement suggests rank or reverence. Heroes, maybe even sacrifices. It's impossible to tell where respect ends and fear begins. The victors might have honored their dead, or they might have buried both friend and enemy together to appease restless spirits. Either way, the battlefield became a temple. Even in death, the fighters were part of a story they believed continued beyond the grave. One skeleton lay with hands clasped over the chest, clutching a polished riverstone painted red. Tests showed the pigment was mixed with ash, likely human. It means someone took time to prepare it, to mark death with art, to make memory out of horror. That's what rituals do. They transform pain into purpose. The fusion of war and faith didn't begin in marble sanctuaries. It began in the dirt, when people first needed to believe that death for the group meant something. The line between sacrifice and slaughter blurred the moment someone whispered a prayer before picking up a weapon. The bones prove it. War and worship were twins born in the same breath. Each gave the other meaning. And long after the fires burned out, the ashes stayed mixed with pigment, the first sacred colour of humanity, painted not on walls, but on the fallen themselves. For a long time, archaeologists treated the valley as a strange exception, a freak event in an otherwise peaceful age. But as the research widened, the pattern began to spread across the map. The more they looked, the more echoes appeared. Far to the north, a lakeshore cemetery revealed skeletons with arrowheads still lodged in their bones. their hands locked in the same desperate poses. Thousands of miles away, in what is now the Nile Valley, a site called Jebel Sahaba showed rows of burials from nearly the same era. Men, women, and children pierced by flint projectiles, some with injuries that had healed before they were struck again. The radiocarbon dates lined up eerily close. These weren't isolated bursts of brutality. They were verses in a repeating song. The pattern reached even farther. In the grasslands of Eurasia, archaeologists found temporary camps fortified with sharpened stakes, strange for people who were supposed to be nomadic. Across ancient Europe, rock art showed scenes once thought to be hunting but later recognized as combat. Lines of human figures facing off with weapons raised, the earliest visual record of battle. Everywhere the same signatures appeared, trauma clusters on skulls. Weapons designed for killing humans, not animals. Burials that separated fighters from civilians. It was as if the world itself had shifted into a new phase of behavior at the end of the Ice Age. Humans were learning to fight, not as individuals, but as groups. The valley wasn't a one-time tragedy. It was the clearest preserved snapshot of a transformation happening everywhere. Some scientists called it the dawn of organized violence. Others saw it as the beginning of politics, the first step toward the societies that would eventually build nations. Because where there is war, there is negotiation, alliance, and identity. The same forces that destroy also bind. Each discovery made the picture more complex. At one site in Central Africa, a settlement was surrounded by a ring of trenches, the earliest known defensive structure. At another, a child's grave contained a tiny spear, a symbol that war had already become cultural, passed down as tradition. It was no longer just survival, it was memory. Each generation inherited both the fear and the method. The valley simply froze one of those moments in perfect detail. You can imagine the stories spreading from place to place, warnings carved into memory instead of stone, the idea of the enemy, the need for unity, the rituals before battle and the mourning after. It was never just one war, it was the human pattern unfolding. The echoes of violence from 10,000 years ago still vibrate in the bones of every descendant. The valley was not alone, it was part of a chorus that began before writing, before history, before nations. A chorus that still hasn't gone silent. When scientists modelled what could have happened after the battle, they realised something haunting. If even one side had survived with strength left to rebuild, this valley might have become the first city on Earth. It had the perfect ingredients: fertile land, access to water, and a people already organised enough to fight in formation. All the pieces of civilization were there, waiting to fuse. A single victorious culture could have united the region, creating leadership, territory, and early laws. The valley could have been humanity's first proto-state, but that future never came. The bones tell the truth, nobody won. Every layer of evidence points to mutual devastation. The attackers vanished. The defenders vanished. After the battle, the valley went silent. No tools, no dwellings, no hearths. Just wind, ash, and emptiness. It's as if the earth itself exhaled and erased what was left. The signs of recovery never appear in the sediment. No new populations settled the site for centuries. It remained cursed ground, avoided by every tribe that passed. The archaeologists can even see it in the pollen record. After the fighting, the plants changed. Grasses grew over what had once been tilled soil. Forests crept in again. Nature reclaimed the battlefield, faster than memory. The valley that could have birthed a kingdom became a grave. the scientists ran simulations to imagine what might have happened if one side had survived. They found that within just a few generations, the victors could have grown into a structured society. Trade networks might have formed, borders might have been drawn, leadership might have crystallized into something like government, but that never happened. Instead, the oldest evidence of statehood would not appear for thousands of years. Civilization was delayed because both sides bled themselves dry. The first treaty that never came was the silence between the dead. No surrender, no truce, no peace, just exhaustion. The double loss changed everything. It showed how fragile progress really was. You can organize, cooperate, and build, but one total war can reset everything. The valley's emptiness became a warning passed forward through generations that never knew its name. It's possible that later humans remembered places like this through myth, stories of forbidden valleys, of gods who destroyed whole peoples for their arrogance. Maybe that's what remained of this event, carried not in bones but in stories of divine punishment. Archaeologists see irony in that. The first great battle could have created the first civilization, but instead it erased the chance completely. The valley froze at the edge of becoming something more, then collapsed back into prehistory. It reminds us that our greatest step forward often balances on the edge of ruin. The first treaty never written, the first peace never made, cost humanity thousands of years. And yet, in that silence, the world was given time to start again. The discovery was supposed to rewrite a small corner of history. Instead, it set the entire field on fire. From the moment the first paper was published, archaeologists began arguing like rival generals. Some said the team had misread the evidence, that the neat lines of skeletons were coincidence, that erosion and time had twisted the picture. Others said this wasn't just a new site, but a new origin point, proof that civilization's timeline had been written backwards. The debate spilled out of academic journals and into documentaries, conferences, and online forums. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to defend. For generations, archaeology had followed a simple story. First came foraging, then farming, then settlements, then war. Conflict was supposed to be the byproduct of complexity. But this valley suggested the opposite. That complexity itself may have been born in war. That the organization needed to fight together came before the organization needed to build together. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant the foundations of leadership, planning, and even culture came not from peace, but from conflict. That theory rattled everything. Textbooks would need rewriting. Old assumptions about human nature would collapse. So the trenches of academia filled fast. One camp accused the research team of over-interpreting. They said the formations of bones could have been caused by flooding. The standardized weapons might have been traded artifacts, not signs of an army. The trauma patterns, they said, might reflect accidents, not tactics. They called it the chaos of nature masquerading as order, but the evidence kept answering back. Radiocarbon dating from 3 separate labs confirmed the age. Spatial mapping of artifacts showed intent. The same injury patterns repeated too perfectly to be random. Every time critics pushed, the data pushed harder. Another camp went further in the opposite direction. They claimed this site didn't just shift history, it reset it. Maybe other lost battles lay beneath deserts and floodplains, waiting to reveal that organized war was a universal phase in early human life. They saw the valley not as an anomaly, but as a missing chapter. Each side held conferences, published counter-studies, and fired volleys of data at each other. It was almost poetic, a battle over a battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Scientists arguing about ancient war had become warriors themselves. And, in a way, that was fitting. The fight for truth mirrored the fight for survival that had played out in that same ground 10,000 years earlier. No one could yet say which interpretation would win, but one fact remained undeniable. The site had broken something open. It forced humanity to look in the mirror and ask if everything we thought we knew about our beginnings had been told in reverse. The valley had started another war. This one fought with words, pride, and data. And like the first, no one was sure who would come out alive. Before this valley, there was no record of anyone dying for an idea. People fought to eat, to survive, to defend their families. But 10,000 years ago, something shifted inside the human mind. The bones here show it. These weren't strangers fighting over scraps. They were people dying for identity. The moment someone carved a symbol into wood and held it high, the world changed. The idea of us versus them was born. It wasn't written down, but it didn't need to be. It lived in how these people saw themselves. One group painted their bodies in red clay, the other in white ash. One carried obsidian blades from the river, the other spears from the hills. Two cultures, two visions of the world, standing face to face, the first war of belonging. Scientists studying the site say this may have been the birth of large-scale identity, the mental software that would later run every empire and nation. The moment humans realized that a shared story could unite hundreds of strangers, they also realized that another story could turn those strangers into enemies. The same power that binds can divide. It's what made people willing to die for a piece of land or a belief, and that pattern never stopped. The carvings found on the broken standard in the center of the battlefield weren't random. They were shared language, shared mythology. The defenders saw themselves as one people defined by that object. Their unity was their strength, and it made them fearless. But unity always creates opposition. If there is us, there must be them. That's the rule humanity discovered here, long before flags or borders. The archaeologists noticed something else too. The farther they traced the remains of both sides, the more they found evidence of ritual markers, symbols drawn in mud or carved into wood, facing the enemy's direction. These weren't battle plans. They were declarations. Primitive banners saying, "We are here and we will not disappear." It's the same impulse that would one day lead to crests, flags, and national anthems. The roots of every uniform, every emblem, every pledge trace back to minds like theirs. What began as survival became identity, and identity became ideology. The mental walls we build today were first drawn in the dirt by people like them. This battlefield was more than a tragedy, it was a prototype. The first time a community saw itself as something greater than the individual, the first time death became meaningful because it protected a symbol, the valley shows how fragile that revelation was. Both sides believed their myth was worth dying for, and both vanished. But the idea survived. It spread in memory, in instinct, in the deep architecture of the human brain. From this moment onward, every story of civilization carries the same echo. We are us, they are them. The river ran red, not just with blood, but with the birth of belonging. Every human alive today carries echoes of that valley, not in memory, but in biology. The same instincts that once drove those fighters to stand shoulder to shoulder still live under our skin. Our loyalty, our fear, our need to belong, even our willingness to fight for something larger than ourselves, all trace back to places like this. The battle wasn't an accident of history. It was part of the software written into our species. Geneticists studying patterns of cooperation and aggression say that the drive to form groups and defend them is ancient. The people in that valley weren't primitive in their emotions. They were us, stripped of comfort and technology. Their brains lit up the same way ours do when we feel danger, pride, or unity. The chemicals that flooded their bodies before a charge are the same ones that surge through soldiers, athletes, and protesters today. Adrenaline, cortisol, oxytocin. The biology of courage and fear intertwined. Psychology calls it group bonding, but it's older than language. The same circuits that once told our ancestors to protect their band from predators began to shape how they saw outsiders. The valley shows the moment that switch flipped from survival to identity, from protecting the group to defending the idea of the group. That instinct never went away. It's why humans can cooperate on massive scales, but also why we turn violent so easily. We're descendants of people who learned that survival depended on unity and that unity required opposition. The archaeologists who studied the bones didn't just see history, they saw a mirror. The scars in those skeletons matched the fractures in our collective psyche. The capacity to love our own group fiercely and fear others instinctively was carved into us by millennia of conflict. The valley just captured one of the first times it surfaced fully formed. Even our sense of fairness may come from this. In small groups, loyalty mattered more than logic. Helping your tribe, even at personal cost, ensured survival. Over thousands of generations, those who cooperated thrived. Those who didn't vanished. The legacy of that process is visible every time people rally behind a flag, defend a teammate, or protect a stranger who feels like family. But the same wiring can turn dangerous. The instinct that once saved us can now blind us. It can make us believe that difference itself is threat. That's the paradox of being human. The valley under our skin gives us both compassion and cruelty. It lets us build cities and wage wars. It connects us and divides us. The battle in that forgotten riverbed didn't just shape who those people were. It shaped who we became. Their fight ended in silence, but their instincts never did. They live in our hearts, our genes, and our stories. We are not just the descendants of survivors. We are the children of the battlefield, still trying to understand what it made of us. The camera lifts from the valley and the past dissolves into the present. The same aerial view that once showed a riverbed of bones now shows the cracked soil of modern war zones. Drones hover where vultures once did. The sound of wind becomes the sound of engines. From above, every battlefield looks the same. Lines of destruction, bodies turned to data, the earth marked by the same patterns our ancestors left 10,000 years ago. The technology changed, but the choreography didn't. We still move in formations. We still raise symbols. We still believe that killing can protect what we love. The difference is that now we know where it began. The excavation trench becomes a mirror, showing us not how far we've come, but how far we haven't. The bones remind us that organized violence wasn't a mistake of civilization. It was one of its blueprints. The same cooperation that built the first camps built the first armies. The same intelligence that planned harvests, planned ambushes. The same hands that buried their dead with care once sharpened blades in the dark. Knowing that truth is uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. If war is part of how we began, it means it's part of what we can change. It isn't a curse written in our DNA. It's a habit, an old story that keeps repeating because we haven't learned how to end it. The scientists who uncovered the valley didn't just rewrite history. They handed us a question. If war came first, can we choose for it not to be our final invention? Every generation since that ancient battle has built on the same foundation of fear and unity. We've created nations, borders, and technologies, all shaped by the instinct to defend or destroy. But we've also built empathy, art, and reason, the parts of us that rebel against our programming. We can dig deeper than instinct. The bones don't predict our future, they warn us. They show what happens when the line between cooperation and cruelty disappears completely. Standing at the edge of that excavation trench, you can almost feel the weight of time pressing down. 10,000 years of progress balanced on the same fragile truth. We are capable of extraordinary unity and unimaginable violence, often in the same breath. But knowledge gives us a choice our ancestors never had. We can see the pattern for what it is. We can choose to rewrite it. The valley will always be there, silent beneath the dust, waiting to remind us where this story began. Whether it also becomes the place where the story finally changes depends on us. The drones fade, the desert quiets, and the narrator's voice asks the question that has no easy answer. If war made us human, what will make us something more?